Part 1. The new home. When I first moved into the house, it felt like a fresh start, a new chapter. My job had become too stressful and the city too crowded. I needed space, somewhere quiet where I could breathe. This house, nestled at the edge of a thick forest, seemed perfect. It was old, sure, but sturdy, with the kind of charm that old homes have: creaky wooden floors, large windows, and a towering oak in the front yard. It was far enough from town that I wouldn't be disturbed, but not so isolated that I'd feel completely alone. I moved in during early spring, the trees just beginning to bloom, casting a light shade over the house. The real estate agent had mentioned that the previous owners were an older couple who had lived there for decades before suddenly deciding to sell and move abroad. I didn't ask too many questions. I was eager to get settled. At first, everything seemed fine, peaceful even. The house felt like it had personality, like it had been waiting for someone to come along and wake it from a long slumber. I spent my days unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting used to the strange quiet that only the countryside can offer. But it wasn't long before I started to notice the small things. The floorboards in the hallway creaked at night, too frequently to be explained by old wood expanding. The taps would drip, no matter how tightly I turned them off. The windows, though tightly shut, would sometimes rattle as if something outside was pressing against them, though there was never any wind. I brushed it all off. Old houses make noise, I told myself. It's just settling in, adjusting to the changes. Then one evening, as I was watching TV in the living room, I heard something odd. A faint scraping sound, like metal dragging across stone. It was coming from the basement. I hadn't spent much time down there. Just a typical old cellar with a stone floor and low ceilings, mostly used for storage. But that night, the sound was persistent. I turned off the TV and strained to listen. There was again scrape, scrape, scrape. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. As I reached the bottom, the air grew cooler, mustier. I shone the flashlight around the room, its beam casting long shadows over the old furniture and boxes. But the sound had stopped. Nothing looked out of place. No signs of anything unusual. Maybe a rat, I thought, or something trapped behind the walls. But as I turned to go back upstairs, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. An old door, tucked away in the far corner of the basement, almost hidden by a pile of boxes. I was certain it hadn't been there before. Curiosity got the better of me. I made my way over and cleared the boxes away, revealing the door fully. It was small, no more than 4 feet tall, with a rusted iron handle and hinges that looked ancient. The wood was dark, weathered, and splintered in places, as though it had been there for centuries, forgotten. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Skra-skra-skrape. The sound was louder now, coming from behind the door. Against my better judgment, I grasped the handle and pulled. It creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, narrow passage that seemed to descend even deeper beneath the house. And that's when I smelled it, a faint, sickly sweet odor like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. Something very, very wrong. I should have stopped then. I should have turned around, gone back upstairs, and never looked back. But I didn't. I stepped through the door, into the darkness. Part 2. The descent. The air changed as soon as I stepped through the doorway. It was heavier, thicker, as though the walls themselves were closing in, pressing down on me with an oppressive weight. The sickly sweet odor grew stronger with each step I took, making my stomach churn. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that barely pierced the dark tunnel ahead. The passageway was narrow, the ceiling so low that I had to hunch as I moved forward. The walls were rough stone, damp to the touch, with moss and mold growing in the cracks. Water dripped from somewhere, its rhythmic tapping echoing around me. As I ventured deeper, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog in front of me, and I shivered despite my thick jacket. I wasn't sure how far down I had gone. The sloping floor was slick with moisture, making every step precarious. And then I saw it, scratched into the stone walls, faint but unmistakable symbols. Strange, crude carvings that looked like twisted runes or symbols, shapes I had never seen before. Some were simple spirals, while others were more intricate, almost like the grotesque outlines of faces contorted in agony. My fingers brushed against one, and for a moment, it felt warm, as though the stone itself was alive, pulsating with some ancient energy. Skrape. The sound was closer now, just ahead in the darkness. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had to know what was making that noise. There was something down here, something hiding beneath my home, and I wasn't going to leave until I found out what it was. The tunnel finally opened up into a small chamber, the walls closing in tightly. The floor was uneven, littered with old tools, rusted picks, broken shovels, things that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I shone the flashlight around the room, and that's when I saw it. In the center of the chamber was a well, its stone edges cracked and worn with age. A frayed rope hung limply from a rotting wooden frame above it, leading down into the darkness of the well's throat. I couldn't see the bottom, even with the flashlight trained on it, just an endless, yawning pit that seemed to swallow the light whole. The scraping sound had stopped. I moved closer to the well, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell was strongest here, the rot almost unbearable. I covered my nose with my sleeve, trying to block out the stench, but it clung to the air like a suffocating blanket. I don't know why I did it, but I leaned over the edge of the well, peering down into the blackness. My flashlight flickered again, the beam weak and struggling to stay alive. And that's when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But as I strained to listen, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, a woman's voice, soft, pleading, barely more than a breath. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. I stumbled back from the well, nearly dropping the flashlight. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I hadn't heard anything. But the voice came again, louder this time, more desperate. "Help me, please!" It was coming from the well. I froze, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. But something about the voice held me there, rooted to the spot. It wasn't just a cry for help. It was familiar. Somehow, I knew that voice. I moved back to the edge of the well, my heart racing. I shone the flashlight down again, but the light couldn't penetrate the darkness below. The voice was louder now, echoing up from the depths, filling the chamber with its desperate plea. "Please, help me." I reached out for the frayed rope, my hand trembling. But just as my fingers brushed against it, I felt something cold, icy cold, wrap around my wrist. I gasped, yanking my hand back, the rope slipping from my grasp. But the cold remained, like invisible fingers clutching my arm, pulling me toward the well. I stumbled back, falling to the ground, my heart hammering in my chest. And that's when the whisper turned into a scream, a deafening, blood-curdling scream that filled the air, reverberating through the stone walls, shaking the very ground beneath me. I scrambled to my feet, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run, but the scream was relentless, piercing, like nails dragging across glass. My vision blurred, the walls around me seeming to close in, twisting, warping, as if the very house itself was alive and breathing. I turned and ran, the sound of the scream chasing me up the tunnel, its echo following me, growing louder with every step. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I finally burst through the basement door, slamming it shut behind me, the scream cut off abruptly, plunging the house into an eerie, suffocating silence. I stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I could still feel the cold sensation around my wrist, as though something had tried to drag me down into that well. And then, without warning, the lights in the basement flickered and went out. Part 3. The darkness. The basement plunged into total darkness. My hand fumbled for the light switch, slapping it up and down, but nothing happened. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the faint echo of that scream still rattling in my skull. My flashlight, which I had dropped in my scramble, had rolled away somewhere in the shadows, leaving me completely blind. For a moment, I stood frozen, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. The air felt wrong, too heavy, too thick, like I was standing at the bottom of a deep lake, the weight of it pressing down on me. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I became acutely aware of the silence, the complete and utter absence of any sound. And then slowly I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thudding coming from the basement door. My eyes widened as I stared into the inky blackness, the sound growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't quite a knock, it was softer than that, almost like a heartbeat. Thud, thud, thud. It was coming from the other side of the door. Something was there, something waiting just beyond the threshold. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs locked in place, refusing to move. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was impossibly close now, like whatever was on the other side of the door was leaning against it, pressing its weight into the wood. I took a slow, shaky step back, the floor creaking beneath me, the old wood protesting under my weight. The faint echo of the scream still lingered in the back of my mind, like a residual ringing that wouldn't fade. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the thudding stopped. I held my breath, listening intently, straining to hear anything beyond the oppressive silence. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt the walls closing in again, as if the house itself was alive, its very structure watching me, waiting for something. A creak sounded above me. I froze, my eyes instinctively darting to the ceiling. The house was old, I reminded myself. Old houses creak. But that wasn't it. The noise was deliberate. Slow, cautious footsteps directly above me. Someone was walking across the floor, their steps slow, measured, like they were carefully moving through my home. Someone or something. My first instinct was to bolt, to rush out the front door, and leave this cursed place behind. But something held me there, an invisible force keeping my feet glued to the ground, compelling me to listen, to wait. Another creak, louder this time, directly above my head. The footsteps were moving, heading down the hallway that led to the stairs, the very stairs I had just climbed to escape the horrors of the basement. My stomach lurched. Whatever was up there was heading for the basement door. The same door I had just slammed shut. The footsteps grew louder, the creaks more pronounced as they descended the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric, like something was dragging behind whoever or whatever was coming. My heart pounded in my chest, the icy grip of fear tightening around my lungs. Then the sound stopped. The air was thick with tension, and I strained my ears to listen, but there was only silence. Complete and utter silence, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then knock. The soft, deliberate sound of knuckles tapping against the basement door. Knock. Knock. I took another step back, the cold sensation creeping up my spine. The door rattled slightly, as though something was pushing gently against it, testing the lock, probing the barrier between whatever was on the other side and me. Knock. My eyes darted around the basement, searching for something. Anything that could offer me some form of protection. My flashlight was still out of reach, and the faint light from the stairwell above barely penetrated the darkened room. I could barely make out the outline of the door, just a sliver of shadow against the deeper blackness. The knocking stopped, but I didn't feel relief. My breath hitched as I heard the faintest scrape of metal, like a key turning in a lock. Click! The door creaked open, its hinges groaning as it slowly swung inward, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness beyond. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, that my mind had been playing tricks on me in the dark. But then I saw it. A pale, slender hand, just barely visible in the dim light, reached through the doorway, its fingers long and skeletal, grasping the edge of the doorframe with a slow, deliberate movement. My entire body went rigid with fear. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I could only watch as the hand gripped the door and began to pull it open wider, inch by agonizing inch. And then, from the darkness beyond the door, I heard the voice again. Please help me. But this time, it wasn't a scream. It was a whisper, cold and venomous, slithering into my ears like a serpent. I backed away, my hands fumbling against the wall behind me as I desperately searched for something, anything, to defend myself. The hands slid further into the room, followed by the faint outline of a figure, barely visible in the dim light. The stench of rot filled the air, stronger now, so overpowering that I gagged. The figure stepped into the basement fully, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes, if it had eyes, hidden beneath a tangled mass of dark, matted hair. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that were too sharp. It moved toward me, slowly, almost lazily, as though it had all the time in the world. I backed up further, but there was nowhere to go. The wall was at my back, the staircase blocked by this thing that had stepped out of the shadows. And then it spoke again, its voice low and guttural, filled with something dark and ancient. "You can't leave." "Not yet." Part 4. The Escape. My heart raced as I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, trapped between the advancing figure and the darkness that clung to every corner of the basement. The thing, whatever it was, moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it stepped closer, its grotesque mouth twitching into something that resembled a smile. That voice, low and raspy, seemed to echo off the walls, filling the space around me like a thick, suffocating fog. "You can't leave." My breathing was ragged, panicked, but I forced myself to move. My hands scrambled along the wall, searching for something, anything, that could help me. My fingers brushed against a cold, metal pipe, and without thinking, I grabbed it, yanking it free from whatever rusted fixture it had once belonged to. The figure was nearly upon me now, its pale, claw-like fingers reaching out, its head still cocked at that sickening angle. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. I swung the pipe with every ounce of strength I had, aiming for its outstretched hand. The pipe connected with a sickening crunch. For a moment, everything stopped. The figure recoiled, its arm twisting back in an unnatural way, bones bending where they shouldn't. But it didn't scream, didn't cry out in pain. Instead, it just laughed, a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to crawl inside my head, digging its way under my skin. "You think that will stop me?" The voice rasped, its tone laced with mockery. "You're already mine." I didn't wait to hear more. My body finally snapped out of its frozen terror, and I bolted for the stairs. The flashlight still lay somewhere in the shadows, forgotten in my rush to escape. The stairs creaked and groaned under my weight, but I didn't dare slow down. My only thought was to get as far away from that thing as possible. Behind me, I could hear the slow, deliberate steps of the figure as it followed, unhurried, like it knew there was no rush, like it knew I had nowhere to go. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the basement door shut, twisting the lock with trembling hands. For a second, I stood there, my back pressed against the door, chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen, of what was happening in my own home. But there was no time to think. I heard it again, the scraping sound. It was coming from the other side of the door. Not like before, not distant and faint. This was deliberate, slow, and far too close. The same scrape I had heard in the basement. The one that had led me to this nightmare. Skap. I backed away from the door, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. The sound grew louder, the door rattling slightly, as though something was pressing against it, testing its strength. I stumbled into the hallway, barely aware of where I was going. The house felt foreign now, like I didn't belong here, like I had trespassed into something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The air was thick, suffocating, and every shadow seemed to writhe and twist, as if they were alive. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house. But as I turned toward the front door, something stopped me dead in my tracks. There, on the walls of the hallway, faint but unmistakable, were more symbols, just like the ones I had seen carved into the stone in the basement. They stretched across the wallpaper in jagged, chaotic lines, glowing faintly in the dim light. How had I not seen them before? A cold realization settled over me. These symbols, these marks, they were everywhere, and I hadn't noticed until now. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of panic that clouded my thoughts. My only goal was to get out of the house, to leave this place behind, to escape whatever was stalking me. I turned and ran for the front door, my fingers already reaching for the handle. But the moment I touched it, the air in the house seemed to shift. A deep, guttural groan resonated through the walls, and the house itself moved. The floor beneath me trembled, the walls creaked, and the door, once inches from my grasp, suddenly seemed much farther away. It was as if the house was stretching, warping itself, twisting reality just out of my reach. The front door was right there, but no matter how fast I ran, it stayed out of reach, the hallway lengthening before my eyes. My heart pounded in my chest, panic surging through me as I pushed myself harder, faster. But the door only seemed to retreat further and further into the distance. I stumbled, my foot catching on the edge of the warped floorboards, and I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my knee. The impact rattled me, and for a moment, I lay there, dazed, struggling to comprehend what was happening. That's when I heard it. A voice. Not from the basement, not from behind the door, but right behind me. Help me. It was the same whisper I had heard before, the same plea that had echoed up from the well. But now it was closer, almost like it was breathing against the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I forced myself to my feet, my entire body shaking, and lunged for the front door one last time. To my shock, my fingers finally closed around the handle. But just as I twisted it, ready to throw the door open and run out into the night, something icy cold wrapped around my ankle, dragging me back with a force so sudden and violent that I was yanked off my feet. I hit the floor hard, my vision going white with pain. But before I could even cry out, I was pulled back into the house, into the dark hallway, away from the door, away from freedom. The thing behind me, it wasn't done with me yet. Part 5, The House of Shadows. I was dragged backward, the cold grip on my ankle tightening like a vice. My hands clawed at the floor, trying to find anything to hold on to, but the wood splintered under my nails. The hallway stretched out before me, twisting and warping as though the house itself was alive, shifting, changing its shape to keep me inside. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I tried to kick free, but the grip only tightened. Behind me, I could hear the breathing, slow, deliberate, unnatural. The thing pulling me was strong, impossibly strong, and no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't break free. My body scraped against the floor, my clothes tearing as I was dragged deeper into the house. The shadows around me seemed to ripple, shifting and moving in ways that defied logic, like living entities that watched my every movement. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the dragging stopped. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart racing as I waited for whatever had grabbed me to reveal itself. But the house was silent now, eerily still, as if it was holding its breath. Slowly, I twisted my body to look back down the hall, expecting to see the pale, twisted figure from the basement. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me and backed against the wall. My ankle throbbed, the cold sensation still lingering where the unseen hand had grabbed me. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the house no longer felt familiar. Every corner was dark, every shadow too deep, too thick, as though the very walls had shifted, closing in around me. I had to get out. Somehow, I had to find a way out. I limped down the hallway, each step sending a sharp pain up my leg, but I ignored it. My mind was racing, my thoughts jumbled and frantic. The front door had been right there, but it had stretched away from me, as though the house was toying with me, bending space itself to trap me inside. And that voice, the one that had whispered from the well, the one that had pleaded for help, it was still echoing in my mind. But I wasn't going to help it. Not now. Not after what it had done. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated, glancing up into the darkened second floor. The creaking from earlier still echoed in my ears, the sound of footsteps moving through the house. Something or someone was up there, and the thought of facing it made my skin crawl. But the front door had disappeared, and the only other exit was through the back. I turned toward the kitchen, limping through the twisting hallways, the air growing colder with each step. The house seemed to close in around me, the once familiar layout warping and stretching, making the walk feel longer than it should have been. Every few feet, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. And then, as I reached the doorway to the kitchen, I froze. The walls were covered in symbols, just like the ones I had seen in the basement. The strange runes and jagged carvings lined the walls, glowing faintly in the dim light. They twisted and spiraled across the wallpaper, covering every inch of the room. I hadn't seen them before. How could I have missed them? They weren't just on the walls. They were everywhere. On the floor, the ceiling, etched into the wooden beams and tiled counters. It was as if the house itself had been branded, marked by something far older, far darker than I could understand. The sickly sweet smell from the basement hit me again, even stronger now, so overwhelming that it made my eyes water. I gagged, covering my mouth and nose with my sleeve, but the stench clung to the air like a thick fog. I backed away, my mind reeling, and that's when I saw it, movement in the reflection of the kitchen window. A figure. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but the room was empty. The only sound was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, and yet I could have sworn I had seen something, just for a split second, standing behind me. A figure, pale and twisted, its mouth stretched into that grotesque smile. My hands shook as I backed out of the kitchen, my heart hammering in my chest. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a faint light, as though they were alive, watching me. I needed to get out of the house now, but I didn't know where to go. The front door was unreachable, and the back door, I didn't trust it, not after what I'd just seen. I stumbled into the living room, the air heavy and thick, like I was wading through molasses. Every inch of the house felt wrong now, like it had shifted into something else, something malicious. The shadows were deeper here, darker, almost tangible as they writhed across the walls, crawling toward me. I looked around, desperate for some escape, some way to get out, but every door, every window, seemed impossibly far away. The walls felt like they were closing in, the room shrinking, the ceiling pressing down on me. My breath came in shallow gasps, panic rising in my chest. And then from the corner of the room, I heard it, a soft, wet sound like something dripping. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, and there, in the far corner, was the source. A dark stain was spreading across the floorboards, thick and black, oozing up from beneath the wood. It glistened in the faint light, its surface rippling as it spread, inching closer to me. The smell, that smell was stronger now, choking, suffocating. I stumbled back, but the stain kept growing, relentless, inching toward me like a living thing. I looked up and saw it. There, in the center of the ceiling, was a single, bloodshot eye, staring down at me. It blinked once, slowly, and then it smiled. The floorboards cracked beneath my feet. Part 6, beneath the floor. The floor splintered with a deafening crack, the sound reverberating through the room. Before I could react, the wood gave way beneath me. I screamed as I fell, the ground opening up like a mouth swallowing me whole. My hands reached out, grabbing at the crumbling edges, but it was no use. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was that bloodshot eye, wide and unblinking, watching as I plummeted into the void. I hit the ground hard, my breath knocked out of me as I landed on cold, damp stone. For a moment, everything was a blur. My ears rang, and my vision swam. The impact had left me disoriented, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Where the hell was I? I forced myself to sit up, my body protesting with sharp stabs of pain. I groaned, blinking away the dizziness. The air down here was even colder, and the familiar stench of rot was overwhelming. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to retch. Slowly, I stood, my legs shaky beneath me. The dim beam of my flashlight lay a few feet away, flickering weakly. I limped over and picked it up, the light barely cutting through the suffocating blackness. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone the beam around, trying to get my bearings. I was in some kind of underground chamber. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture, and the ceiling was low, forcing me to stoop slightly as I moved. The chamber stretched out into the distance, its far corners shrouded in impenetrable darkness. I couldn't tell how large it was, but the sheer size of it felt wrong, like it shouldn't exist beneath my house. The dripping sound was louder down here, constant and rhythmic, echoing off the stone walls. I swallowed hard, shining the light in the direction of the sound. The beam flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed as though they had a life of their own. And then I saw it. The walls of the chamber were covered in them, the symbols. The same twisted, jagged runes I had seen upstairs. But here they were larger, more intricate, carved deep into the stone. They seemed to glow faintly in the dark, pulsating with a sickly, otherworldly light. My stomach twisted as I realized they weren't just decorations. They were part of something larger, something ancient and malevolent. I followed the symbols with the beam of my flashlight, my hands trembling as the light revealed more of the chamber. And then, at the far end of the room, I saw what I had been dreading. There was another well. It was smaller than the one in the basement, but it was unmistakably the same, a dark, gaping hole in the floor with frayed ropes hanging limply from the ceiling above it. The stone around the well was stained black, as though something had seeped out of it and soaked into the ground. I could feel it from where I stood. Something was down there, waiting, lurking in the depths. The voice came again, echoing up from the darkness of the well. "Help me!" But this time, the voice was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was clearer, more urgent, filled with something that sent ice down my spine. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening in this house, whatever was beneath it, it had been waiting for me to find it. I approached the well slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to leave, to find a way out of this nightmare. But my legs kept moving forward, drawn by some unseen force. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, growing brighter as I neared the well. I stopped at the edge and peered down into the darkness. The well seemed deeper than before, its bottom hidden in shadow, but I could sense something down there, something moving, shifting just beyond the reach of the light. And then, from the depths of the well, a hand reached up, pale and skeletal, its fingers long and thin. The hand grasped the edge of the well, pulling something up from the darkness. I stumbled back, my heart leaping into my throat as I watched the figure emerge. It was her, the woman from the basement, the one with the twisted smile and the eyes hidden beneath a tangle of dark hair. Her body was impossibly thin, her skin stretched tight over her bones, and her movements were slow and deliberate, like something not used to being in the light. She dragged herself out of the well, her limbs bending in unnatural angles, her mouth twitching as though trying to form words. And then she looked at me. Her eyes, once hidden, were nothing but black pits, endless voids that seemed to suck the very air from the room. She stood there, watching me, her head cocked at that sickening angle, her smile widening as though she could sense my fear. "You're almost there," she whispered, her voice a rasping, hollow sound. "You've seen the truth, but you haven't seen it all." I backed away, my pulse racing, but the walls of the chamber seemed to close in around me. The symbols on the walls pulsed faster now, brighter, as if they were alive, reacting to her presence. "What do you want?" I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. Her smile widened, her teeth sharp and jagged. "I want you to understand." Before I could react, she moved, faster than I could comprehend, faster than any human should be able to move. In an instant, she was in front of me, her cold fingers gripping my wrist with a strength that made my bones ache. "You will see," she hissed, her breath cold against my skin. "You will see what this house is hiding." I tried to pull away, but her grip was ironclad, unrelenting. And then, without warning, she pulled, dragging me down into the well. The world around me blurred, the stone walls of the chamber dissolving into darkness as I was yanked into the abyss. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mind was overwhelmed with terror, my body numb with cold as I was dragged deeper and deeper into the void. And then everything went black. Part 7, The Abyss. I plunged into the darkness, the air rushing past me as the walls of the well vanished from sight. It was an endless fall, my stomach lurching as I tumbled through the void. There was no light, no sound, just the feeling of being dragged deeper and deeper into a black nothingness. My mind scrambled for a foothold, for anything that could make sense of what was happening, but it was impossible. It felt like falling into a nightmare, only there was no waking up. The cold wrapped around me like a shroud, so intense that it numbed my skin and pierced my bones. I tried to move, to fight against the force pulling me down, but my limbs were useless, frozen in place. It was like I had been swallowed whole by the house itself, consumed by whatever malevolent force lurked beneath it. And then, just as suddenly as the fall had begun, it stopped. I landed hard on something solid, the impact jarring every bone in my body. The air was knocked from my lungs, and for a few moments, I lay there, gasping, disoriented. The world was still dark, a crushing blackness pressing in from all sides. My head throbbed, my heart pounding in my chest, and the cold, God, the cold was unbearable. I slowly pushed myself up, my muscles aching with the effort. My hands scraped against rough stone, cold and wet, and as I got to my feet, I realized that wherever I was, it was far below the house. The air was thick, suffocating, like the atmosphere of a place untouched by time, by light, by life. My flashlight gone, but as I blinked into the oppressive dark, something flickered at the edges of my vision. Faint, but unmistakable, a dim glow, like embers smoldering in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see that I was in some kind of cavern. The walls were jagged stone, damp with moisture, and the ground beneath me was uneven, littered with rocks and debris. And then I heard it, the voice again. "Help me!" It was closer now, more distinct, as if it were coming from right beside me. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, my eyes straining to see in the dark. The faint glow pulsed again, just enough to illuminate the outline of the cavern around me. I could see the passage leading deeper into the earth, a jagged tunnel that seemed to stretch on forever. And then there, just at the edge of the glow, I saw her. The woman, the same twisted figure from the basement, her pale form barely visible in the dim light. She stood at the mouth of the tunnel, her back to me, her limbs still unnaturally long and thin. Her head was tilted, as though she were listening to something just beyond the darkness. The sight of her sent a cold wave of dread through me, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from her as possible. But then she spoke. "You're almost there," she whispered, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Just a little further, and you'll understand." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Something held me in place, some unseen force that seemed to pull me toward her, just like before. The cavern felt alive, the walls pulsing with that same eerie energy, the symbols from the house now faintly glowing on the stone. They twisted and writhed, almost as though they were trying to form words, trying to communicate something I couldn't yet understand. The woman began to move, her footsteps unervingly silent as she slipped deeper into the tunnel. I hesitated, my mind racing. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around, to run back the way I had come and escape this madness. But there was no going back. Not now. I had seen too much, and I had to know what lay at the end of this nightmare. I followed her. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until I had to duck my head to avoid scraping it against the jagged stone. The faint glow grew stronger, and I could see more of the symbols etched into the rock, spiraling and looping in ways that hurt to look at for too long. The air grew heavier the deeper I went, thick with moisture and that same sickly sweet smell of decay. The woman stayed ahead of me, always just out of reach, her movements fluid and unnerving. She never looked back, but I could feel her presence, like a cold hand pressing against the back of my neck, urging me forward. And then, after what felt like hours of walking, we emerged into another chamber. This one was vast, far larger than the basement or the cavern I had fallen into. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into the shadows above, and the floor was uneven, covered in strange formations that jutted up like ancient pillars. The glow was stronger here, emanating from the walls themselves, casting an eerie light over the space. In the center of the chamber stood an altar. It was old, far older than the house, older than anything I had ever seen. The stone was worn and cracked, covered in more of the symbols that now glowed with a faint, sickly light. Around the altar, arranged in a perfect circle, were several figures, twisted, deformed shapes, barely human. They knelt before the altar, their heads bowed, their hands clasped together as if in prayer. And on the altar, lying motionless, was a body. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The figure on the altar. Was it human? The woman from the well? I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The body on the altar was pale, almost translucent, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face was obscured by a veil of dark hair, but I could see the sharp angles of its jaw, the hollows of its cheeks. And then, slowly, the head turned. It was me. I staggered back, my mind reeling, my vision swimming as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure on the altar, the body lying motionless before the twisted congregation. It was me. My face, my features, my body. But how? I turned to the woman, the one who had led me here, my voice trembling with terror. What is this? What's happening? Her smile widened, her teeth gleaming in the dim light. You've been here all along. Before I could respond, the figures around the altar began to move. Their heads lifted, and I saw their faces for the first time, distorted, hollow, with eyes that were nothing but black pits. They rose to their feet, their movements slow, deliberate, and turned toward me. The room grew colder, the air thick with something I couldn't name, something ancient and dark. I tried to step back, but my legs refused to move. You're part of this now, the woman whispered, her voice filling the chamber like the hiss of a snake. You've always been part of it. And then, from the shadows, the chanting began. Part 8. The chanting. The chanting was low at first, just a faint hum, barely more than a whisper. It echoed off the stone walls of the cavern, filling the space with a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. The figures surrounding the altar moved slowly, their heads bowed, their lips moving in unison as the chant grew louder. It wasn't in any language I recognized, more like a series of harsh, guttural sounds strung together into a rhythm that made my chest tighten with every word. I was frozen, my body refusing to obey me. My legs, my arms, everything felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force that kept me rooted to the spot. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my heart hammering in my chest, but I was powerless to move, trapped in place as the chanting grew louder, more insistent. The woman stood beside me, her pale face split into that grotesque smile. She didn't join the chant, but her eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction as she watched the ritual unfold. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in time with the chanting, their faint glow growing stronger with each passing second. The air was thick with something oppressive, something ancient and malevolent, pressing down on me from all sides. My gaze was drawn back to the altar, to the body that lay motionless in the center of the room. My body. I couldn't understand how it was possible. How could I be lying there, lifeless, while I stood here, watching? Every instinct screamed that I needed to escape, to get out of this place, but I couldn't look away. The figures around the altar swayed as they chanted, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were part of some twisted dance. Then, without warning, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. The figures stood still, their heads bowed, their faces hidden in shadow. The air was so cold now that I could see my breath fogging in front of me, Each exhale, a shallow gasp in the icy stillness. The woman stepped forward, her movements slow and fluid, as though she were floating rather than walking. She approached the altar, her eyes never leaving the lifeless form that lay there. Her hand reached out, pale and skeletal, and she gently touched the body's forehead. My forehead. I felt it. The icy cold, the touch of her fingers against my skin, though I wasn't on the altar. I was standing here, watching, and yet I felt it. The sensation shot through me like an electric current, paralyzing me with a mix of terror and confusion. How is this possible? You understand now, she whispered, her voice carrying through the silence like a snake's hiss. This is your home. You belong here. My heart pounded in my chest, the cold sinking deeper into my bones. No, I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. I don't belong here. Her hand tightened on the body's forehead, and I felt it again, a sharp, stabbing pain that shot through my skull, cutting off my words. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air in the cavern was thick, suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I tried to step back, to pull away from whatever force was holding me there, but my legs refused to move. You've always been part of this, she said, her voice soft but firm. This house has been waiting for you. It was always yours. I shook my head, my heart racing. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. This isn't mine. I don't belong here. Her smile widened, and she leaned in closer, her breath cold against my skin. But you do, she whispered. You've been here before. You've lived this before. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Lived this before? How could that be possible? This house, this nightmare, was something I had never experienced, something I had stumbled into by accident. But the way she looked at me, the way she spoke, there was a certainty in her voice that sent chills down my spine. You don't remember, do you? She asked, tilting her head in that unsettling way. But you will. She gestured to the figures surrounding the altar, their heads still bowed in silence. They all remember. They've seen this before. The figures shifted slightly, their forms swaying in the dim light. I could feel their eyes on me now, though I couldn't see their faces clearly. There was something wrong with them, something inhuman about the way they moved, the way they stood. It was as if they were waiting for me to remember, waiting for something to happen. I backed away, my legs finally obeying, but the woman's voice followed me, soft and insistent. You've been here before, she repeated, her eyes gleaming. And you'll come back again. You always do. My breath came in shallow gasps, panic rising in my chest. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in around me, the symbols on the stone glowing brighter, more insistent. The figures by the altar moved closer, their heads lifting slightly, revealing faces twisted and deformed, eyes hollow and empty. I turned to run, but the cavern stretched out impossibly far. The tunnel I had come through had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The only way out was deeper into the unknown, deeper into whatever nightmare this was. The chanting started again, low and guttural, filling the air with a deep, rhythmic hum. The figures swayed in unison, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were drawing energy from the very stones of the cavern. The woman's smile never wavered as she watched me, her eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. You can't escape, she whispered. You never escape. I stumbled backward, my head spinning, my body trembling with fear. The chanting grew louder, echoing off the stone walls, filling every corner of the chamber. The glow from the symbols pulsed in time with the chant, growing brighter, more intense, until the entire cavern seemed to throb with an ancient, malevolent energy. And then from the altar, I heard it, a gasp. My head snapped toward the body lying on the stone, the one that wore my face. It had moved. Its chest had risen, just slightly, and its fingers twitched. My heart raced, panic flooding my veins as I watched my own lifeless body begin to stir. The figures surrounding the altar chanted louder, their voices rising in a crescendo of harsh, guttural sounds. The body's chest rose again, more pronounced this time, as if it was drawing in air, my air. No, I whispered, stepping back. No, this can't be happening. But it was. My body, the body on the altar, was waking up, and I was still here, trapped, watching it come to life. Part 9. The Awakening. The body on the altar, my body, moved again. This time it wasn't subtle. Its chest heaved as if it were taking a deep breath, its fingers flexing like they were testing the air. I stood frozen, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would explode. I watched in horror as the body slowly sat up, its head turning slightly as if becoming aware of the world around it. It looked like me, exactly like me, but there was something wrong with its movements, something unnatural. Its head jerked to one side, then the other, as though it was adjusting to being alive again. It lifted its arms, studying them, and then it looked at me. Our eyes met, and for a moment, I saw a reflection of myself in those hollow, lifeless eyes. But there was no recognition, no humanity behind them. It was like staring into a mirror of something other, something that had taken my form, but had none of my soul. The figures surrounding the altar chanted louder now, their voices a rhythmic hum that reverberated through the cavern. The symbols on the walls pulsed in time with the chant, their glow intensifying until it felt like the entire chamber was alive with some ancient, malevolent power. The thing on the altar, my doppelganger, stood, its movements jerky and disjointed. It took a step toward me, its mouth curling into an unnatural smile. The chanting rose to a fever pitch, filling the air with a thick, oppressive energy that seemed to seep into my skin, into my bones. My legs shook, but I couldn't move. It was as though the very air had become a prison, holding me in place as the creature advanced. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat, and my feet refused to move. The horror of what I was seeing, the sheer wrongness of it, froze me in place. This thing, it wasn't just wearing my face. It was me, and somehow it had been lying here, waiting for this moment. It stopped just a few feet from me, its twisted smile widening as it reached out a hand. My heart thundered in my chest as I backed away, my legs finally obeying the desperate commands from my brain. I stumbled over the uneven ground, nearly falling, but managed to keep my balance. No, I muttered, my voice barely a whisper. This isn't real. This can't be real. But it was real. Every movement, every sound, every terrifying moment was all too real. And the thing with my face, myself, was closing the distance between us. The woman from the well watched with that same eerie, knowing smile. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, and I could feel the satisfaction radiating from her as if this was all part of some grand design. She had led me here, through the twisted paths of the house, into the depths of this nightmare, all for this. You see now, she whispered, her voice cutting through the noise. You were always meant to be here. This is your place. No, I shouted, finally finding my voice. This isn't me. This isn't. The creature lunged. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as its hand slashed through the air where I had been standing. It moved fast, too fast. I hit the ground hard, the stones scraping my hands, but I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The thing hissed, its face contorting in a grotesque mimicry of rage. It came at me again, faster this time, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion, trying to make sense of how this could be happening. How could it be me, and yet not me at all? I ducked just in time as it swung at me again, its fingers curled in claws. It wasn't just trying to capture me, it was trying to kill me. I could see it in the way it moved, in the cold, hollow expression on its face. I backed away, trying to put distance between us, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber was vast, but the walls seemed to close in, the shadows warping and twisting with every movement I made. The symbols on the walls pulsed faster, more erratically, feeding off the chaos in the room. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, the voices of the figures surrounding the altar rising in intensity. It was as if they were willing the creature to succeed, urging it on as it came at me again, relentless and unstoppable. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to move. I dashed across the chamber, my feet slipping on the damp stone as I made for the far end of the room. The creature was right behind me, its footsteps unnervingly silent as it chased me through the dark. I skidded to a stop at the edge of the chamber, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My eyes darted around, searching for any way out, but there was nothing. No door, no passage, just the jagged stone walls of the cavern rising up around me like a prison. I was trapped. The creature slowed as it approached, its twisted smile returning as it realized there was nowhere for me to run. It took its time, savoring the moment, its black, hollow eyes locked on mine. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, for anything that could save me. But there was nothing. I was alone, and this thing that wore my face was going to take my place. It was going to kill me, and then it would be me, and no one would ever know. Just as the creature lunged for me again, something shifted in the air. The chanting stopped. The sudden silence was so jarring that it felt like the world itself had come to a halt. The creature froze, its hand inches from my throat, its head snapping to the side as though it had heard something. The figures surrounding the altar went still, their heads turning in unison to look at the woman. She stood there, her smile gone, her eyes narrowed as she stared at the altar. Something had changed. The air felt different, heavier, colder, like the atmosphere had shifted in a way I couldn't explain. The creature hesitated, its hand dropping slightly. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I saw something flicker across its face. Fear. The woman stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the altar, her expression unreadable. Step back, shaking my head. No, I muttered, my voice trembling. No, this isn't right. This isn't real. But the reflection in the mirror only smiled wider. It's real, it said, stepping closer to the glass, its eyes gleaming with a strange light. You just don't remember. Suddenly, the house shifted again, the walls warping and twisting as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The floor beneath me groaned, and the light in the hallway flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach out toward me. I turned, desperate to escape, but the hallway stretched impossibly far, elongating in a way that defied logic. Every step I took toward the front door only pushed it farther away. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was calling to me, pulling me back into its depths. You've been here before, the reflection said, its voice following me no matter how far I ran. You'll be here again. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from that reflection, away from the twisted whispers and the impossible walls. The house stretched out in every direction, twisting and warping as I sprinted down corridors that shouldn't exist, up staircases that spiraled endlessly, through rooms I had never seen before. But no matter where I went, the reflection was always there, waiting for me. In every window, every mirror, every darkened surface, it stared back at me, smiling that cold, empty smile. You can't escape, it whispered. You belong here. I stumbled through a doorway, crashing into a room that seemed unfamiliar at first, until I saw what was waiting for me. The altar. It was there, in the center of the room, surrounded by the same twisted symbols I had seen in the cavern. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the room was bathed in a sickly, pale light that made my skin crawl. My stomach lurched, and I felt bile rise in my throat as I realized what was lying on the altar. It was me. Again, the body, my body, was there motionless, its chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. The face was mine, the features identical, but the skin was pale, the lips a sickly blue. I could hear the faint whisper again, the same desperate plea that had echoed in my mind before. Help me! I took a step back, my legs shaking uncontrollably. This was impossible. It couldn't be happening. I had seen the body before, I had helped it before, but now it was back, and so was the voice. You belong here. The reflection in the mirror whispered, appearing beside the altar. You've always belonged here. My mind reeled. Every part of me screamed to run, to escape this endless nightmare. But I was trapped. The house had become a maze of twisted corridors and impossible rooms, the walls shifting and warping around me. There was no way out. And then the body on the altar opened its eyes. They were my eyes, wide, terrified, pleading. "Help me," the voice gasped, the words barely audible. "Please." I backed away, shaking my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "No," I muttered, my voice trembling. I can't do this again." But the body sat up, its movements slow and jerky, as though it were fighting against some unseen force. Its eyes locked onto mine, filled with desperation, and it reached out a hand. "Help me," it whispered, its voice trembling. "I don't want to be here. Please." The reflection smiled, its eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Choose," it whispered. "You have to choose." I looked from the reflection to the body on the altar, my mind spinning. Everything felt wrong, twisted, but there was no escape. The house was alive, shifting, trapping me in its endless nightmare. And now, I was being forced to make a choice. But what if the choice I made wasn't real? Part 12. The Unraveling. The room seemed to breathe around me, its walls pulsing in and out like the chest of some enormous, unseen creature. Every symbol etched into the stone flickered with that sickly glow, casting shadows that seemed to ripple and crawl across the floor. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. My eyes darted between the reflection in the mirror and the body on the altar. Both were me, but neither of them felt real. My mind screamed for some clarity, for a way to understand what was happening. But the more I tried to grasp the situation, the more it unraveled. The reflection smiled again, tilting its head in that disturbingly familiar way. Its eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger, as though it was waiting for me to make a mistake. "You have to choose," it whispered, the words echoing in my mind like a twisted mantra. "You can't leave until you decide." The body on the altar stirred, the breath rattling in its chest like it was struggling to stay alive. Its hand reached out toward me, trembling, its voice cracking with desperation. "Please, don't leave me here." I took a step back, my legs shaky beneath me. The floorboards groaned in protest, the sound blending with the frantic whispers that filled the air. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, caught between two versions of myself, each one calling out for something I didn't understand. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "What am I supposed to do?" The reflection in the mirror didn't answer. It simply stood there, its smile widening as it watched me flounder. The figure on the altar, though, seemed to grow more desperate, its eyes pleading with a silent intensity that shook me to my core. "You have to help me," the voice from the altar rasped. "I'm trapped. You can't leave me here." The reflection tilted its head further, its eyes narrowing. "It's lying," it hissed. "This isn't a choice. It's a trap." My mind spun, torn between the two versions of myself, unsure of who or what to trust. The voice on the altar, my voice, was so real, so genuine, but the reflection's warning echoed in my head, planting seeds of doubt that took root and festered. I took another step toward the altar, my body trembling with uncertainty. The figure lying there, pale, weak, broken, looked up at me with those wide, terrified eyes. My eyes. It wasn't just some twisted version of me. It felt like a part of me, a piece of my soul that had been torn away and left here to suffer. "Please," the body whispered again, its voice barely audible. "Don't let me die here." The reflection in the mirror snarled, its face twisting with rage. "You can't trust it," it screamed, the calm mask breaking into a vicious, hateful expression. "It will take you down with it." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The air in the room seemed to pulse with an unbearable pressure, and the glow from the symbols on the walls grew brighter, more chaotic, as though they were reacting to my indecision. I didn't know what to do. My mind was spinning out of control, torn between two impossible choices. The house was alive around me, twisting and warping, feeding off my confusion and fear. "Make your choice," the reflection hissed, its voice cold and venomous. "You have to choose." I looked down at the body on the altar, its chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The fear in its eyes, the fear in my eyes was palpable, almost suffocating. My hand trembled as I reached out toward it, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a vice. "Help me," the voice whispered, barely a breath. With a surge of desperation, I made my choice. I grabbed the hand of the body on the altar, my fingers closing around its cold, trembling skin. The moment I touched it, a shock of cold shot through me, freezing my blood and sending a wave of nausea crashing over me. The reflection let out an ear-splitting scream, its face contorting in fury. "No!" It shrieked, its voice high and shrill, like nails on glass. "You've made a mistake. You'll never escape now." But it was too late. The moment I touched the body, something inside me snapped, like a door swinging open deep within my mind. The world around me blurred, the walls of the room warping and twisting as the light from the symbols flared to a blinding intensity. The whispers grew louder, deafening, filling my head with a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words overlapping in a chaotic jumble. The ground beneath me trembled, and the air felt thick with static, as though the very fabric of reality was coming apart. And then, just as suddenly, the world went dark. I was falling again, tumbling through the void, the sound of the reflection screams echoing in my ears. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion, but through the chaos, I felt something pulling me, dragging me deeper into the darkness. Time stretched and twisted, moments blending together into an endless stream of nothingness. I wasn't sure if I was dead or dreaming, or if this was just another layer of the nightmare that had consumed my life. But through the darkness, I could hear the voice, the same voice that had called to me from the well, from the altar. It wasn't pleading anymore. It wasn't scared. It was me. "You're almost there," the voice said, its tone calm, almost soothing. "You're finally waking up." I tumbled through the void, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind struggling to make sense of the words. But before I could respond, the darkness gave way to light. I was lying on the floor, the cold, hard floor of my house, the house that had started this nightmare. I blinked, disoriented, my head throbbing with pain as I tried to sit up. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light filtering through the windows cast long shadows across the room. It was quiet, too quiet. The whispers were gone, the oppressive presence of the house nowhere to be felt. For a moment, I didn't move, my mind reeling as I tried to piece together what had just happened. The cavern, the altar, the reflection. It all felt distant, like fragments of a dream I was already beginning to forget. But something was different. Something had changed. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and looked around the room. The house was empty, silent, as though it had never been alive at all. The walls, once covered in twisted symbols, were bare, and the air was still. But the mirror was gone. The room where I had seen the reflection, where the creature had worn my face, there was no sign of it now. It was as if that room had never existed. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow, my heart still racing. The house was still quiet, but the sense of unease lingered just beneath the surface. I had chosen, but had I chosen right? Part 13, The Return. I stood in the stillness of the house, the heavy silence pressing down on me, my mind racing to catch up. Everything was eerily quiet now, the oppressive hum and whispering voices gone. But despite the stillness, the feeling of dread remained, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. My body ached, every muscle sore and exhausted, but I forced myself to move. I had to see if the house had really changed. I needed to know if I was truly free, or if this was just another layer of the nightmare I'd been trapped in. The hallways looked the same as before, but they felt different. There was no more flickering light, no more twisting shadows or walls warping around me. The symbols that had once crawled along the walls, glowing with a sickly light, had vanished entirely. It was as though the house had reset itself, erasing every trace of the horrors I had witnessed. But as I walked, the silence felt too complete, too unnatural. My footsteps echoed loudly, the sound sharp and clear in the empty rooms. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, half expecting to see the reflection of myself, the creature that had haunted me, that had worn my face, lurking in the corners, waiting to strike. But the house was empty, and that emptiness felt wrong. I made my way to the front door, my heart pounding as I reached for the handle. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt the cold metal beneath my fingers. The door wasn't stretching away from me anymore. It wasn't playing its cruel game, retreating with every step I took. It was right there. I twisted the handle and pulled. The door swung open easily, revealing the outside world beyond. The quiet forest, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting long shadows across the front yard. It looked normal, peaceful, as if nothing had ever been wrong. But my gut told me otherwise. I stood in the doorway, frozen, unable to cross the threshold. I should have been relieved. I should have felt some sense of triumph at finally reaching the exit, at escaping the nightmare that had trapped me in this house. But instead, all I felt was a deep, gnawing unease. I wasn't free. Not yet. I took a hesitant step forward, out into the yard, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest stretched out before me, the same as it had always been, but something about it felt different now. The air was too still, too quiet, as though the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I took another step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty, like a giant waiting to swallow me whole if I dared to turn my back on it. I forced myself to keep walking, one foot in front of the other, until I was standing in the middle of the yard, the house behind me and the forest stretching out before me. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. "Help me." My blood ran cold. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat as I stared back at the house. It was the same voice, the same desperate, pleading voice that had called to me from the well, from the altar. But now it was coming from inside the house, from deep within its walls. I stepped back, my pulse racing. I couldn't go back. I had escaped. I had made my choice. The reflection, the body on the altar. They were both part of the house's twisted reality, trying to pull me deeper into its nightmare. I had survived. I had won. But the voice persisted, growing louder, more urgent. "Help me, please." It was my voice. It was me. I shook my head, backing further away from the house. "No," I whispered to myself. "I can't. It's over." But the voice wouldn't stop. It echoed through the air, filling the silence with that same desperate plea. "Help me, please." My hands trembled, my heart pounding in my ears. Every part of me screamed to keep walking, to leave the house behind and never look back. But the voice, it was my voice, was pulling at me, dragging me back toward the door. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting inside. But the more I tried to ignore the voice, the louder it grew, until it was impossible to ignore. I glanced over my shoulder, the forest beckoning me to leave, to run and never return. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place as the voice continued to call out to me from the darkness inside the house. "Help me!" With a shaky breath, I turned back toward the house. My mind screamed at me to stop, to leave while I still could, but I couldn't resist the pull. I couldn't leave that voice behind, no matter how much I wanted to. I stepped back toward the house, my feet dragging across the grass as though I were moving through molasses. The door still hung open, the dark interior of the house yawning before me like the mouth of some great beast. My heart raced as I crossed the threshold, stepping back into the house's suffocating embrace. The moment I entered, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a gunshot. I froze, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I realized what I had just done. I was back inside. The house was silent, the air thick and oppressive. But the voice continued, calling to me from somewhere deeper within. "Help me!" I moved through the darkened hallways, the once familiar layout of the house now warped and twisted in ways I couldn't understand. The room seemed to stretch out before me, elongating into impossible corridors, the walls pressing in on me from all sides. I followed the voice, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me down the hall, past the living room, through the kitchen, deeper into the heart of the house. And then I saw it, the mirror. It was hanging on the wall at the end of the hallway, gleaming faintly in the dim light. My reflection stood in it, waiting for me. But this time, it wasn't smiling. It wasn't twisted or malevolent. It just stared at me. The voice was coming from the mirror. "Help me," the reflection whispered, its eyes wide with fear. "Please, you have to help me." I stood there, frozen, staring at myself in the mirror. The reflection looked like me, but there was something off, something distant in its eyes, like it was trapped just as I had been. "You can't leave me here," the reflection said, its voice trembling. "I'm trapped. You have to let me out." My mind reeled. Let it out? I shook my head, stepping back from the mirror. "Oh, imutara. I've been through this already. I'm not falling for this again." But the reflection's expression changed, its face contorting with fear. "Please," it begged, its voice cracking. "If you leave me here, I'll die. We'll both die." My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The reflection, my reflection, was pleading with me just like the body on the altar had. But this time, there was no other choice. There was only the mirror. The reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. "You have to trust me," it whispered. "I'm the real you." I hesitated, my hand hovering just inches from the mirror's surface. The reflection stared back at me, its eyes wide and terrified, its voice trembling with fear. "I'm trapped," it said again, its voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, let me out." I swallowed hard, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know it was real anymore. I didn't know if I was making the right choice. But I couldn't leave the reflection, myself. Trapped in the mirror, not after everything I had been through. With trembling fingers, I reached out and touched the glass. The moment my skin met the surface of the mirror, the world shifted again. The glass rippled beneath my touch, and I felt a cold, electric jolt run through my body. The reflection smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Thank you," it whispered. And then the world went black. Part 14, The Switch. The darkness swallowed me whole. It was like plunging into icy water, the world around me vanishing in an instant. My breath caught in my throat as the cold washed over me, numbing my body, my mind, until I wasn't sure if I was even alive anymore. There was no sound, no light, just a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides, crushing me under its weight. And then, slowly, the cold began to fade. The darkness lifted, not all at once, but in fragments, like I was waking up from a deep, restless sleep. My head throbbed with pain, my limbs heavy and sluggish as I blinked, trying to make sense of my surroundings. I was standing in the hallway again, the same hallway I just walked through, but something was different now. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, and the house itself seemed wrong. It was as though the walls were closing in on me, the once familiar layout twisting and warping into something unfamiliar. I looked around, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. The mirror. It was still there, hanging on the wall at the end of the hallway, but this time I was inside it. I froze, staring at the reflection. My own face stared back at me from the other side of the glass, wide-eyed and filled with fear. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization hit me like a freight train. I was trapped. No, this isn't right, I muttered, my voice trembling. I reached out to touch the surface of the mirror, but my hand met cold, solid glass. The reflection mimicked my movements, its fingers pressing against the inside of the mirror, just like mine. But it wasn't me. It was out there. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panic gasps as I stared at my own face, the face that was no longer mine. The reflection smiled, a slow, cold smile that spread across its lips like a crack in the glass. "Thank you," it whispered, its voice barely audible, but I heard it clearly. "I've been waiting for so long." My mind reeled, spinning out of control as I tried to process what had just happened. The reflection, the thing inside the mirror, had switched places with me. It was free now, roaming the house, wearing my face, while I was trapped inside, watching helplessly from the other side. "Let me out!" I screamed, banging my fists against the glass. But the reflection just stood there, watching me with that same twisted smile. "You shouldn't have trusted me," it said, its voice calm, almost mocking. "You made your choice." I pounded on the glass, desperate, my heart racing as I tried to break free, but it was useless. The mirror didn't budge. I was trapped, locked behind the glass, while the thing that had taken my place walked freely through the house. "No," I muttered, shaking my head in disbelief. "This can't be happening. This isn't real." But it was real. The weight of the truth crashed down on me like a tidal wave. I had been tricked. I had made the wrong choice. I had let the thing out, and now it was walking around in my body, living my life while I was left behind in this cold, hollow prison. I watched as the reflection, my reflection, turned away from the mirror, its face expressionless, and began walking down the hallway. I screamed after it, pounding on the glass, begging for it to come back, to switch places with me again, but it didn't even turn around. It just kept walking, its footsteps echoing through the house, growing fainter and fainter until they were gone. The house was silent now. The reflection was gone, out of sight, and I was left alone, trapped in the mirror, staring at the cold, empty hallway. I slumped against the glass, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. I was trapped, completely and utterly trapped, with no way to escape. But then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard a sound, a soft, faint whisper. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. It was the same voice, the same desperate, pleading voice that had led me through the house, through the nightmare. It was coming from deep within the walls, echoing through the empty halls like a distant cry for help. "Help me!" The voice repeated, more urgent this time. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Where are you?" But the voice didn't answer. It just kept whispering, over and over, the same desperate plea. "Help me, please." I turned, my eyes scanning the endless darkness behind the glass. The reflection was gone, but the voice, it was everywhere, filling the air with a suffocating weight. I couldn't see where it was coming from, but I could feel it growing louder, closer, as though it was right behind me. I took a step back, fear tightening in my chest. The mirror felt like it was closing in around me, the air growing colder with every passing second. The whispering was louder now, more insistent, like something was right behind me, waiting for me to turn around. And then, from the depths of the mirror, I saw something move. It was faint at first, barely visible, but it was there, a shadow, slithering through the darkness behind the glass, growing larger, more defined. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it creep closer, its form twisting and writhing like a living thing. "Help me!" The voice whispered again, but this time it was different. It wasn't pleading anymore. It was mocking. The shadow grew larger, its shape shifting into something that made my stomach twist with horror. It was human, or at least it had once been, but now it was warped, twisted, its limbs too long, its face contorted into a grotesque, hollow grin. My heart pounded in my chest as the shadow reached the surface of the mirror, its black eyes staring at me through the glass. And then it spoke. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice a cold, hollow rasp. "You're part of this now." I stumbled back, my pulse racing as the shadow pressed its hand against the glass, mimicking my movements, just like the reflection had done before. "You're one of us," it said, its grin widening. "You always have been." The glass began to crack. A thin fissure spread across the surface of the mirror, spiderwebbing out from the shadow's hand. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest as the cracks grew larger, spreading across the entire surface of the mirror. The air around me seemed to thicken, the cold pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. The shadow laughed, its voice low and guttural, as the glass shattered. The mirror exploded into 1,000 shards, the pieces raining down around me like jagged ice. I covered my face, ducking as the shards scattered across the floor, their sharp edges glinting in the dim light. When I looked up, the shadow was gone, but I was still trapped. The house stretched out before me, the same as it had always been, but now I was part of it. The glass was gone, the mirror shattered, but I could still feel its presence, lingering just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. And I knew I was never getting out. Part 15, The House Takes Its Own. I stood there, surrounded by the shards of the mirror, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air in the house had shifted again, growing thick with a sense of finality, of inescapable doom. I was still here, trapped, but the house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like it was swallowing me whole, pulling me deeper into its twisted reality, making me part of it. The reflection was gone, the shadow had disappeared, but I could feel them both inside me, woven into the very fabric of this place. I could hear the faint whispers echoing in the walls, not just the familiar plea for help, but a cacophony of voices, all layered on top of one another, blending together into a single, endless hum. I wasn't alone, but I wasn't myself anymore either. I took a step forward, my foot crunching on the broken glass, and the sound echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls like a gunshot. The light in the hallway flickered once, twice, and then dimmed to nothing. The house was draped in shadows now, thick and oppressive, wrapping around me like a cold blanket. I tried to move, to make sense of what was happening, but the shadows seemed to press in closer with every step, guiding me, hurting me towards something I couldn't see. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out individual words. "Join us," one voice rasped. "Come back," another whispered. "You can't leave," a third voice colder hissed. They surrounded me, filled the air, consumed my thoughts. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was creeping in, but it was no use. The voices were everywhere, seeping into my mind like poison, twisting my thoughts, pulling me deeper into the house's grasp. I had been tricked twice, first by the reflection, then by the shadow. But now I realized the truth. There had never been an escape. There had never been a choice. From the moment I stepped foot in this house, it had marked me, claimed me as one of its own. And now it was finishing what it had started. I walked down the hallway, the air growing colder with each step. The house groaned around me, as if it was waking up from a long slumber, its very foundation shifting beneath my feet. The once familiar room seemed to stretch out in impossible directions, twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. I could feel the house's presence in every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the walls. I reached the living room, the dim light barely illuminating the space, and froze. In the center of the room stood a figure. At first, I thought it was the reflection again, the thing that had taken my place. But as I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized it was something else. It was tall and thin, its body hunched and twisted, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its face was a mask of agony, its hollow eyes staring straight ahead, unblinking, as though it had been frozen in place for centuries. And then it moved, its head jerked toward me, its black, hollow eyes locking onto mine. The shadows around it shifted, writhing like living things, twisting into grotesque shapes that filled the room with an oppressive sense of dread. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward me, its movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The air grew colder, the shadows closing in tighter, and I felt a chill run down my spine as the thing stepped into the dim light. Its face, its twisted, tortured face was mine. Not the reflection, not the shadow, but me. A version of me that had been trapped here, consumed by the house, twisted into something unrecognizable. Its mouth opened in a slow, unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth that glinted in the faint light. It raised a hand, beckoning me forward, its voice a rasping whisper that sent chills through my entire body. "Welcome home." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The house, it wasn't just taking pieces of me. It was remaking me, twisting me into something else, something that could never leave. The shadows pressed closer, the air thick with the sound of whispering voices, all blending together into a single, deafening chorus. "You belong here. Join us. You'll never leave." I tried to turn, tried to run, but the house wouldn't let me. The shadows closed in around me, their cold tendrils wrapping around my limbs, holding me in place. The figure with my face stepped closer, its grin widening, its black eyes gleaming with something dark and ancient. "You've been here before," it whispered, its voice echoing through the room. "You'll be here again." I struggled against the shadows, my heart racing, but it was no use. The house had me now. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing me deeper into its dark embrace, twisting me into something I could barely recognize. The figure reached out, its cold fingers brushing against my skin, and I felt a surge of ice shoot through my veins. My body stiffened, my breath catching in my throat as the shadows closed in completely, swallowing me whole. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. The world faded away, the house, the voices, the figure, all of it consumed by the void. I was floating again, weightless, lost in the endless dark. And then, slowly, the darkness receded. I opened my eyes. I was standing in the hallway. The same hallway I'd been in before. The same house. The same walls. But something was different now. I looked down at my hands, my breath catching in my throat. They weren't my hands anymore. They were pale, twisted, my fingers unnaturally long, my skin stretched tight over my bones. My body felt different, wrong, like I was wearing someone else's skin. I looked up at the mirror on the wall. The same mirror where I had once seen my reflection. But now there was nothing. No reflection. No face. Just empty glass. And I realized with a cold, sinking feeling what had happened. The house had taken me. I was no longer myself. I was part of the house now. Part of its endless nightmare. Trapped in its walls. Doomed to wander its twisted halls for eternity. The whispers returned, soft and insistent, echoing in my mind. "You're home." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth opened, but my voice was gone. The house had taken everything, and I was never getting out. Underscore, 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 underscore. The end.